discussion today is around industrial unionism and COSATU, and it relates to a study that the three researchers, Shane Godfrey, Ian Mashoon and Mario Jacobs conducted together with COSATU and COSATU's affiliates in 2021 to 2023. They'll obviously say a lot more about the study, but it's a significant piece of work, and it's recently being published in a two-part article. And so the authors will speak to their findings in the study. Maybe just I'll say a quick word about each of the speakers, and I hope that you will add any details that I miss or that others will do so. I think all three are well known. Ian Mashoon, it was in the early 90s a sociology lecturer at University of Cape Town. And he published at the time on growing union membership and COSATU's story in the 80s and the 90s. He was subsequently at the Sociology of Work Unit Swap at Wits University, where he was deputy director before joining. Of course, he would have been with Eddie Webster, the late Eddie Webster, and subsequently joined the Department of Labour. I'm not sure what year you joined, Ian?
98.
98. Okay, so for many years, he held the position of Director of Collective Bargaining at the department, and subsequently Chief Director of Employment Standards, and continues to do independent research. So if I've left out any key elements, please do share them with us. And then I'll introduce all three. Shane started off his career in the 80s. As an assistant secretary for the Industrial Council of the furniture manufacturing industry in the Western Cape, before he went on to do his articles, and then he continued in some trade union capacities, but also importantly picking up in the early 90s as a researcher, initially also in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cape Town, and in the late 90s moving as a researcher to the Small Enterprise Project at the Institute of Development and Labour Law at UCT, where he continued in various roles until his retirement in 2019, I think it was. Shane, when was your retirement? I forget. It was after 2019.
Yeah,
2023, 2022.
2022, yeah.
Yeah. Where he retired as Director of the Labour Development and Governance Research Unit in the Department of Commercial Law and Sociology, and he was also still in Sociology Department there. At UCT, Mario Jacobs has also been both at UCT and UWC. And he's currently a lecturer and researcher at Centro. For 10 years prior to that, almost 10 years, he was based in the research unit at UCT. And before that, he has more than a decade's experience as both an organizer, a regional secretary, as well as a legal coordinator of SAMU, the South African Municipal Workers Union. So I'm going to end there, and then I'll hand over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just apologize. My camera is not working, so I'll remain anonymous, but visually that is. But let me start. I must say, I think thanks for that introduction, Debbie. It makes me remember an early principle when I worked in the Department of Labour that we spoke about in skills development, where I spent some time, and that is lifelong learning. And I think working with Shane and Mario on this project brings that back to mind, that we try to review quite a long history and learned a whole lot of new things in the process. And I'm sure that's not, we hope it won't stop at this point. But coming to today's webinar, and thank you to Centro for hosting it, let me just introduce and set the scene. And the first thing I would like to do is just to acknowledge the ILO for funding the work that we did with COSATU back in 21, as Debbie mentioned. And I think I'd also want to acknowledge COSATU for their interest in the work and for engaging us. And I think a special word of thanks to Matthew Parks. I'm very glad that Matthew is here to respond to the presentation. But Matthew had absolutely unwavering commitment to the work throughout and supported us and that made a huge difference. So thanks for that. What we set out to do for COSATU some years ago was to slightly different to what we're presenting today. It was to establish what the situation is in the federation with regard to affiliates organizing beyond their constitutional scope or beyond their sectoral boundaries, starting to encroach on other sectors and very often compete with other affiliates for membership. And COSATU wanted us also to unpack why this was happening, or is happening, let me say. And then the second leg was to present some strategic options to COSATU for debate, taking account also of the international experience and how best they could deal with what we called then the demarcation problem. So that resulted in a fairly lengthy research report, and then after that was completed, handed over, we built a bit on that research and reflected and came up with the article that we now have in New Agenda, the 100th issue, I'm pleased to say. And we're going to present it in three parts. I'm going to briefly just sketch the problem and some of the first part of the article. I'll hand over to Mario to complete that section, and then Shane will speak largely to the second part of the article in New Agenda. So on the first part, let me say that our point of departure for the research and for the article is COSATU's one industry, one union policy, which is really a commitment, not new historically in the South African Union movement, but it took a slightly different shape, as we'll hopefully make clear, in COSATU's period, where there was a very strong commitment to a model of industrial trade unionism. That is an orientation to large national unions based in one or two select industries: mining, clothing, textiles, transport, etc. And this was adopted at COSATU's inception, at its formation in '85, and it's still today a policy principle in the Federation, despite the fact that there have been many changes, not only in COSATU, but also in the labor market, in the economy, over the past 40 years. And what the Federation, we say, what the Federation faces at the present is a much more complex scenario, one in which many affiliates within COSATU have moved away from the founding principle towards a multi-sectoral form of union organization. And broadly speaking, that's the point of departure and one of the first problems that the article tries to sketch and to grapple with. Now, that's not a unique problem in South Africa. Internationally, there's been a trend of industrial unionism, but what's interesting, if one looks at other countries, is that that model has undergone very significant change through the 90s, from the 90s onwards in particular. And there have been new forms of organization emerging through processes of restructuring and what's often called revitalization within the trade union movement. And we advocated something similar to COSATU, that at the very least, it's time to revisit its founding principle of one industry, one union, and also to think of a process of revitalization. Hopefully we can come back to that in discussion. The context for that is many changes, obviously, in the labor market in South Africa that have shaped the changes, well, shaped the context within which unions are operating, and that have implications that go often beyond just the trade union structure and the organizational strategy. But they also have implications for sector-level collective bargaining. And there's a strong synergy, and that's why we've put the article in two parts, a very strong synergy between, on the one hand, trade union structure, the organizing structure of COSATU in this case study, and on the other hand, the collective bargaining arrangements that it engages in. And those are really the two strands of the article that we will deal with. I'm just going to go on to say a few things about the first part of the article, where we try and sketch the re-emergence of industrial unionism from about the early 70s onwards. Let me say that industrial unionism is it's not unique in South African history at that point. It has a very, very long history, but the early industrial unions, for various reasons, never really were able to consolidate or were able to succeed and become permanent until what we see in the 70s. And the 70s, the history is sketched out in the article. I'm not going to go over it, but it starts sometime ahead of COSATU's formation. I think a driving force was the formation of COSATU in the 70s, and its influence on the adoption of of this trade union structure of a national industrial trade unionism. But the high point is clearly, in our view, the formation of COSATU in 1985 and the merger process, which I must say I think has probably not been given enough attention in the history of South Africa's labor relations and trade union history. But the merger process between the affiliates from about 85 through to the early 90s, the affiliates that made up the federation. Now, just to give you a sense of that significance from a numerical point of view, COSATU started in 1985 with 33 affiliates. And in roughly 6 years, they reduced that number to 12 large industrial trade unions. The quote we take from the literature to describe that is a process of a forced march, if you like, from a large, very diverse, politically diverse in terms of sectors and membership unions into a cohesive set of 12 trade unions that were significant in size, significant in their numerical strength, and became increasingly significant in their influence beyond just the shop floor on national politics and so on. The membership, for your interest, in 1985 was 462,000 roughly members in 33 affiliates of COSATU. 6 years later, that membership triples to 1.258 million plus. And COSATU made up at the time almost half of all registered trade unions in the South African labor market. So its rise to prominence was nothing short of phenomenal. And the next largest federation, just to compare, was NACTU, and they had about 327,000 members, less than a third of COSATU's size. Now, one can go on to unpack that period of growth, but I would certainly argue that there's quite a strong relationship between the organizational strategy of a strong adherence to an industrial union model and the rapid growth within the membership and within the power and influence of the affiliates and the federation as a whole during that period. A second point just to note is that's particularly striking about this early period is that COSATU at that time is concentrated in the manufacturing sector almost entirely. It represented about 48% of the total workforce in manufacturing, and it had up to about 94 and a bit beyond, it had a very, very small presence in the public sector. And what we try and show in the article is how certain changes take place within the Federation, and I think Shane and Mario will pick up on this, and you have a complete reversal of the nature of COSATU as a federation and its concentration in different parts of the economy. Another point to note is that during this early period, with the consolidation of the affiliates that form COSATU through the merger process, but they also start to participate in what was then the industrial councils and today the bargaining council systems. The first unions were MAU, National Union of Textile Workers, MAU being the Metal and Allied Workers Union, that entered into the industrial councils, and others followed quite quickly. So I think after that, there was a natural progression towards a more centralized form of collective bargaining that aligned to the size and power of the large industry-based affiliates that made up COSATU. Now, the last point, let me just say that there are many lessons that one can draw from this early period, or if you like, the first phase in the story that we try and deal with. And there are lessons to do with the operation of a federation that one can look to and debate coming out of this period. And in particular, the relationship between the federation and its affiliates. The lessons about how to manage demarcation, bearing in mind this very dramatic merger process that takes place from about 85 onwards for a short period. And the critical lessons also for the organizational strategy for COSATU, but I would like to think for trade unions more generally. Hopefully we can pick up on some of these in discussion, but let me hand over to my colleague Mario Jacobs, who will talk a bit more about the second part and how the picture in COSATU begins to change and how the industrial union model begins to slip and slide from the 90s onwards. Over to you, Mario.
Thank you, Ian, for that valuable introduction, including where the two-part article started off, which was the ILO-funded study and as initiated by COSATU. I just want to make the first point that I think it's certainly encouraging to see that there are many people either from sociology or from the trade union movement, and I think certainly representing both independent trade unions, those associated with COSATU, with COSATU, and even FEDUSA present in this particular session. So in as much as the article speaks to COSATU, many of the realities goes beyond COSATU as a trade union federation, and we will begin to speak to some of those examples. So, I mean, as Shane pointed out, one of the areas we looked at is the historical emergence of COSATU and how COSATU as a federation, almost from inception, directed affiliates to establish clear, defined industrial unions. So the 33 COSATU affiliates initially was directed to merge into 12 demarcated industries. But what we also acknowledge is that even though there was a clear Congress resolution that these mergers need to take place within a specific time frame, and initially it was indicated to be a period of 2 years, that many of those mergers did not unfold in the manner as was planned or certainly resolved by Congress. and a number of key factors influence that. Some of that include the individualistic nature of some union leaders at the time. So some of them argued that if they were to merge with another union, that they would lose their positions, whether it be as general secretary, deputy general secretary, or vice general secretary, as it was known at the time. And as a consequence of losing your position, you obviously wouldn't lose influence in terms of the management of the new trade union that came about. There were obviously also clear political differences, and some smaller unions argued that if they were to merge with a bigger union, then essentially they will be swallowed, meaning they will have less influence in terms of direction that they had initially set out for themselves. Ian, can I just perhaps ask you to mute? Ian, can you perhaps mute? Thank you. So some of the examples is that, and then the first one would be one of contestation. So in the case of COSATU, was formed in 1990 only, and that was primarily due to the divisions that exist within CAUSA at the time. In the case of the transport union COSATU, that was only formed in year 2000 after protracted merger talks between the then Transport and General Workers Union and the South African Railway and Harbour Workers Union. Now, one obvious challenge was there was no clear definition of industry and the demarcation boundaries, and that simply would be to say there was no clear policy directive where the boundary of one industry would end and the boundary of another industry would start. And that was from the onset, and we've seen that much of this has continued to manifest itself within the current manner within which COSATU affiliates operate, but as I will explain a bit later, also to a greater extent. So there was much disagreements over industrial boundaries, and I think one of the earlier examples that can be made, and Comrade Betwell is here holding the Mau flag high, was the contestation between whether Eskom should be organized by the National Union of Mine Workers or whether it should be organized by MAWU, which is, as Ian correctly pointed out, is the Metal and Allied Workers Union. MAWU later became part of what is now known as NUMSA, or the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. And the decision by the COSATU CC to say that Eskom must be organized by NUM was informed by the geographical location of coal supply to the mining sector. So the fact that coal as a key component in the generation of electricity was the determining factor, as opposed to whether it could indeed be split between mining, between NUM as one affiliate and NUMSA as another affiliate. Interestingly, both NUM and NUMSA in the current period continue to organize workers at individual Eskom plants. And likewise, the example between local government, which was organized by the South African Municipal Workers Union, and health and hospital workers, organized by Nahawu, being the public sector union within COSATU. So the demarcation of industries was therefore a contested terrain from the start, and it continues to be a contested terrain today. The current reality, however, is that in many instances, there's been the current period marks almost an open contestation for membership with many COSATU affiliates, overlapping in terms of the organizing scope. And I'll briefly come to that. Another problem that we could identify, and at the time of the first few congresses of COSATU, COSATU maintained a clear position, and that clear position was to say that there can only be one union within a defined industry. And the example of Nahawu will always be an interesting example, in that Nahawu was set up, so to say, as the public sector or public service union within COSATU. But later on, COSATU started admitting other unions that organizes within the public service as members or as affiliates of COSATU without placing a condition that those unions seeking to join COSATU must, in the first instance, merge with Nahawu or become part of Nahawu in order to be admitted to COSATU. So, I mean, one example would be Public and Allied Workers Union of South Africa, or PAUSA in short, that was admitted to COSATU as a public service union, notwithstanding the existence of Nahawu as a key public sector affiliate of COSATU. I think in the same context, the COSATU constitution and certainly policies does not provide for occupational directed trade unions to exist under the fold of COSATU, because occupational directed affiliates was deemed to be seen as against industrial-based trade unions. Yet we've seen the teachers union in the mid to late 80s, Post Office and Telecommunication Workers Association, now CWU, being admitted as affiliates of COSATU, notwithstanding the existence of affiliates already organizing within that particular space. An interesting point that Ian made as part of his introductory notes is the shift in the makeup of COSATU. COSATU, I mean, at the time of its formation was, well, over 95% private sector based. And we've begun to see a significant shift in terms of the makeup of COSATU as a federation. And by way of an example, in 1991, only 7%, in 1991, only 7% of total membership in COSATU came from the public sector. By 2012, that percentage increased to 39%. When you go to the article in the new agenda, you will see that that percentage has now surpassed the 50% mark. So from a under 5% makeup of COSATU by 1991, or certainly by 1987, when Samoa Nahawu was formed, to close to 60% in the current period, is a significant shift in terms of the makeup of COSATU. And I mean, I've given figures for the period 1991 to 2012, but also significantly is that by 2013, the total income generated by COSATU in the form of funds accounted for 38% from public sector unions. So public sector unions, both in terms of numbers and in terms of the financial contribution they make towards COSATU, have become certainly the bigger players in terms of much of the COSATU we know today. There are, I mean, obviously, two further things that stand out in relation to this. Firstly, the fact that COSATU never realized the creation of a single public sector union. And then secondly, public sector unions don't just organize within the public service, but public sector unions also organize within the private sector. And that has further contributed to the blurring of lines between the public and the private sector, and creating further complexity of industrial and union boundaries. Now, going alongside the fact that there's been a significant shift from private sector membership to public sector membership, in the private sector, with private sector unions, particularly the manufacturing unions, experiencing declining membership. And those declining membership are obviously brought about by deindustrialization, the emergence of platform work, externalization of work, and similar kinds of changes in the labor market. Many of the COSATU private sector unions amended their organizing scope. And when they amended the organizing scope, they would venture into the organizing scope of an existing COSATU affiliate. So essentially, you find a situation where many COSATU affiliates have overlapping organizing scopes. And that obviously has created significant tension within the federation. Other unions have gone to organize beyond their constitutional scope without even amending their constitutional provision as would be required in terms of the law. But moreover, I think what has been concerning, and much of this is the outcome of interviews, many of the, or certainly a significant proportion of the unions that amended their organizing scope, or those that went to organize beyond their constitutional scope, did so without seeking the approval of the Central Executive Committee of COSATU. In terms of COSATU policy, before amending your organizing scope, you need to bring it to the attention of the CEC, and the CEC will determine whether it is appropriate for you to amend your organizing scope, particularly if it means that you then venture into the organizing scope of an existing COSATU union. And then I think perhaps just a further point I would want to make is that there's also been quite a bit of internal fragmentation and major splits that has happened within COSATU, as well as unions that used to be part of COSATU but no longer. And I think two examples suffice here. I think the major example is that at the time, and probably still the case, is the largest trade union in South Africa, which is the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. And I say largest in the context of NUMSA claiming to be the largest. When they were expelled in 2014, and one of the reasons that caused NUMSA to be expelled is the fact that they took a Congress resolution to start organizing in many other sectors. One, they didn't traditionally organize, but also in sectors that were now organized by other COSATU affiliates. Whether there's legitimacy in the NUMSA argument that they were now going to organize along value chains is irrelevant for the purposes of this particular discussion. But NUMSA nonetheless took a decision to organize beyond their traditional scope. They expanded into the organizing scope of other COSATU affiliates. That was one of the reasons why they were subsequently expelled from COSATU. They later on became one of the key drivers alongside of the Food and Allied Workers Union, FAWU, to establish SAFTU, or the African Federation of Trade Unions. Now, what that has created is obviously a greater intensification of rivalry between unions that used to be part or falling under the same umbrella, that is COSATU, to a greater sense of intensification, and also with that a fractured labor movement. And just finally, we can never ignore, as has already been pointed out, that many of these shifts in the labor market, primarily affecting the private sector unions, comes about as a result of a changing labor market, particularly the industrial base of the labor market, and alongside that is the growth of the public sector, and much of that, in our opinion, contributed to almost a weakening of the central authority within COSATU, creating a number of political divisions that, as a sum total, undermined industrial unionism and accelerated the decline of the industrial union trade union model. I will stop there and hand over to Shane Godfrey.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you to Ian, who started out talking. I'm going to talk about the implications of the decline of the industrial union model for COSATU's centralized collective bargaining aspirations, and then I'll briefly end with touching a little bit on our conclusions and one or two recommendations that we made. Hopefully I have enough time for that. So as we know, when COSATU was formed in 1985, most of its affiliates had decided to participate in industrial councils, or were certainly leaning that way, although they were still treating the system with a certain amount of caution. But clearly the decision to go into a statutory system of collective bargaining that sought to promote industry-wide bargaining aligned well with COSATU's industrial union structure and its founding principle of one industry, one union. So after its formation, affiliates increasingly started to join councils. But the industrial council systems that the unions confronted was a patchwork of mainly local and narrow subsectoral councils. Only a few had achieved a national industry-wide footprint. Just a few years before COSATU was formed, there were a total of 101 industrial councils, of which over 3/4 were small local or regional, sectoral, and even narrow subsectoral councils. Only 13 of the 101 had a national scope. Some years later, in 1992, with COSATU and NACTU unions on many industrial councils, the number of councils had fallen to 85, with only 7 national councils. So if one wants to translate COSATU's goal of one industry, one union for its structure into centralized bargaining terminology, one could talk about one industry, one national council. Then there was a lot of work, given that typology I've sketched out of the industrial council system, there was a lot of work COSATU needed to do to rebuild that system in the way it wanted. And when the 1995 Labour Relations Act was being negotiated, one got an indication of what COSATU wanted, because COSATU, together with NACTU and FEDSAL, sought to make a major step towards restructuring the centralized bargaining system when it proposed that the Act should establish about the Act should establish about 30 bargaining forums across the economy. So these would be set up by the statute. And then collective bargaining would be, so the system would cover the entire country. Collective bargaining would be triggered on those bargaining forums when unions within the scope of each bargaining forum reached a 50% threshold. Ultimately, the unions weren't able to carry the day with that proposal, and they couldn't persuade government and employers to go along with it. So the new Bargaining Council dispensation that emerged in the new Labour Relations Act continued in core respects to look very much like the Industrial Council legislative framework, albeit with some quite important refinements and amendments to try and effect improvements. Also in the new Act, there was the introduction of statutory councils. They haven't been a success at all and haven't really changed much in the collective bargaining system. What did change a lot was the inclusion of the public sector within the LRA and the set of dedicated provisions for a highly centralized bargaining system in the public service. So what has happened since the new LRA was introduced and since that time? So first, the story of what's happened in the private and public sector are so different that one can really start speaking about two distinct centralized bargaining systems operating, one in the private sector, one in the public sector. In the private sector, the number of bargaining councils has continued decline since that dropped to 85 in 1992. In part, that was because of mergers, which was a good thing because it saw councils coming together to become national structures or cover a wider sectoral scope. But there was also the collapse of a lot of the smaller councils that happened and the disappearance of those councils. There was also a huge increase in the coverage of the bargaining council system. Now, a lot of that was because of the inclusion of the public sector council in the Act and their coverage by bargaining councils. That was well over 1 million workers were added. But the private sector bargaining council system also increased its coverage of workers. So by 2020, there were 41 bargaining councils. 21, just over half, were national councils. So you're seeing a big change in the shape of the bargaining council system. And there were only 13 of the small local or regional councils left. The coverage of workers stood at just over 3 million compared to less than 1 million in 1992. And that coverage was split almost exactly half and half between private sector and public sector. So that's a fairly good picture of the bargaining council system at that point. But when one digs down into some of the data, one comes across some very unhealthy aspects to the system. And we gathered data. I mean, we had some existing data on 2004, and I think it was 2012 or 2014. And then we gathered data on the 16 biggest private sector councils with a view to really looking at the issue of trade union representativity within the bargaining council system, and then specifically COSATU's representativity within that system. Now, the first point when looking at the data is that aggregate trade union representativity across councils has fallen to only 33% compared to the 63% of employers. And that's a big drop from 2004. and employers has remained almost unchanged since 2004 at a fairly healthy 63% representativity. Only 12 of the 39 private sector councils did union have a representativity higher than 50%. So, which is a decline from 32 councils in 204, where unions had a higher representativity than 50%. So unions are increasingly becoming dependent on employers' organizations, the representativity of employers' organizations for the extension of agreements. And fortunately, employers' organizations at a large majority of bargaining councils are still higher than 50% representativity. The public service bargaining council system is a completely different story to the private sector. And there you have this remarkable representativity for unions at just under 97% on those councils. So looking specifically at, I've been talking more about the union presence in general on those councils, looking specifically at COSATU's presence. We found that most COSATU private sector affiliates were represented on bargaining councils. So 20 of the 37 bargaining councils had COSATU unions on them. With COSATU, SACTU, NUM, SAPAU, and SACAU probably have sitting on most councils, between 6 and for COSATU and 2 councils for SACAU. But the problem is that the representativity of those COSATU affiliates on those councils was extremely low, and in aggregate across all those 20 affiliates, their representativity on those councils was only 9%. And really the only COSATU affiliate that stood out was SACTU, which had an aggregate of representativity of 60% at 3 of the 5 councils it was on. Again, the public service is a very different story. COSATU's 8 public sector affiliates have an aggregate representativity on the public sector councils and the local government council of 54.5%. So COSATU just on its own would be representative on those councils. So the bargaining council system has gone through 3 important changes. First, bargaining councils have become bigger and cover more workers, but there are still major gaps. There are major sectors where there's negligible presence of bargaining councils, or there are no bargaining councils at all. And one thinks of construction and retail as 2 really important sectors that fall into that category. Second, trade union representativity has decreased steeply across the private sector councils. Third, the coverage of the public sector councils has increased rapidly and now reflects the much larger presence of public sector unions in the union movement and in the labor relations system at large. When one looks at COSATU specifically, it mirrors most of those trends. Its presence in the private sector bargaining council system has shrunk significantly, and there are important sectors where it doesn't have an affiliate, or its affiliate on bargaining councils are very weak. But in the public sector bargaining councils, as I've indicated, COSATU just on its own is a very powerful force store. So just to touch on the conclusions, and in our reports to COSATU, we gave quite detailed conclusions with some recommendations, and I'm with a sort of short and medium timeframes and some legal and some transition type recommendations. I can't go into all of those. Just to stress, we definitely didn't propose some sort of blueprint for a new organizing model or collective bargaining model to replace industrial unionism. What we did do is that we argued that the economic, technological, and labor market environment no longer supports industrial unionism as it did in the past. In other words, the message coming out of that was COSATU needed to engage with this question of replacing the industrial union model with something new. We're clearly aware and stress this, that it's a very complex issue. It's going to require a lot of debate within COSATU. It's going to require experimentation. It's going to require some failures and learning from that. And it's going to require a lot of strategic thinking. Notably, when one looks at this burgeoning trade union revitalization literature, that literature underscores that there's no blueprint. And what the literature also underscores is that COSATU and South Africa aren't engaged in this issue on their own. This is something that's happening around the world, and that's generated this this literature on trade union revitalization. So that literature points to the fact that there's no blueprint for a new union model. Even if there's agreement within unions about the need to move towards a new model, it's still going to be a very long road ahead for unions to actually arrive at something more appropriate to the current environment. Having said that, it's also not a new issue within COSATU. The September Commission way back engaged with this issue in, I think it's in its 10th report or the 10th chapter. It considered various options. It made a proposal, it arrived at a proposal in the end. And this stimulated some debate within unions about forming super unions and cartel unions. And we picked that up in some of the interviews we did. But nothing concrete resulted from that debate, and it seemed to have petered out at some point. So what we wanted to do was suggest a way forward that would stimulate the debate. And our proposal was that COSATU explore a shift from an industrial to a sectoral structure. And our understanding of a sector is that it's a broader classification, that it's an industry. And a sector would normally comprise two or more related industries based on a correspondence of their broad economic activity that they were engaged in. Whether it's a primary activity like cultivation or extraction and mining, whether it's construction and civil engineering, whether it's a range of manufacturing subsectors, or whether it falls within the service sector, which can be divided obviously into private and public. In the recommendations to COSATU, we suggested the following: that they could look at 5 sectoral super unions or unions. The first would be a mining, energy, civil engineering, and construction sector union. Second, a manufacturing sector union. Third, a services sector union. Fourth, a public sector union, which would include parastatals and state-owned enterprise. In other words, not just the public service, but parastatals and SOEs, but excluding parastatals and SOEs operating within specific industries. So Eskom would go with the energy, go into that energy sectoral union, and Transnet would go in, for example, would go into the transport and services sector union. And then the fifth would be an agricultural and domestic sector union. We didn't put that forward as being, this is what the aim is, this is what you must come up with. We envisaged that, and we argued that this is probably just a stepping stone on the way to a final form of unionism that COSATU would arrive at. And it would maybe just provide a foundation for further debate and reflection and strategizing. And then, once one established that, one could look at then what gets added, the allied sectors that could be added to those sectors or divided between those sectors. And one could start also even looking at value chain segments and whether one brings a value chain dimension to some of those sectors. Together with that proposal, we didn't come up with a specific recommendation about how to restructure the private sector bargaining council system. but COSATU needs to be thinking urgently about the private sector bargaining council system and the sorts of challenges it's facing. And it needs to think about that in conjunction with the search for a new organizing model. And it's vital if COSATU wants to strengthen sector level bargaining and optimize the benefits of bargaining for its members, that the objective would be for it to further rationalize bargaining councils, to expand the scope of each council and encompass broader sectors, so that you see COSATU affiliate structures and bargaining councils, if they take this sectoral form, starting to fit together and mesh more than is the current state. We emphasized at the end it's an extremely difficult and complicated task, but trade unions have achieved some remarkable things in the past. What we wanted to push to COSATU was there needed to be engagement about it. There needed to be a debate within COSATU about a way forward. Thank you. That's everything.
Thank you, Shane, Ian, and Mario for sharing the depth of your study in a short time. So we have Matthew Parks from COSATU. For those of you who don't know Matthew, he's both a UCT and a UWC graduate, and he's held office as COSATU's parliamentary coordinator for more than a decade. And before that was also involved in parliamentary work and in with the ANC as well as COSATU in various structures. So as Ian and Mario mentioned, Matthew, did engage in the study. So we are very grateful that you have agreed to join us to respond. And then just after that, we'll have some time for questions and engagement around the study. So I'll just introduce Paul Benjamin. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Paul. He's a director of Cheadle Thompson and Haysom, and also has a foot at UWC as an extraordinary professor at UWC. And of course, in the early days of his practice with Cheadle Thompson, he undertook major cases for the trade union movement. He served as a technical advisor for the Constitutional Assembly and has been involved in developing and drafting labor legislation, among a multitude of other activities. So I'm going to end off there. I'll hand over to, I hope Matthew, you're still with us, and then Paul will take over for the last segment. And thanks again to our authors.
Okay, no, thanks, Debbie, colleagues. I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, so it's difficult to rebut or disagree with anything that Shane and Ian and Mario put a lot of effort into. Really is quite enlightening work. And I think even quite, groundbreaking in terms of assessing the state of the labor movement. Not just COSATU, obviously COSATU is the biggest one, federation, but the broader labor movement across the country. Maybe I can just kind of some thoughts. I think maybe to emphasize some sectoral, economic, organizational challenges, maybe some successes, and maybe some setbacks. I think people often make the noise about public sector, the shifts. I think that the paper kind of highlights, but I think we often forget that pre-1994 we weren't a normal society. It was not easy for unions to organize in the public sector, and obviously the demographics too. That time was largely white, Afrikaans, etc., etc. So it was always natural post '94 with the opening of the public sector. Unions were now able to organize there. You're not going to find that under the dark days of apartheid. Also, as we enter the kind of the global economy post '94, the deindustrialization. So what happened in the clothing industry, where we lost about half the jobs in the clothing sector as we open up, or remove trade barriers, etc. So that had an impact. If you look at in the mining industry, in the 80s they had about 1 million mine workers jobs, but with mine shafts getting so deep, automation, etc., we've seen the mining industry shed about 60% of its jobs. That also has an impact. So, and NUM, which had 500,000 members that time, today because of those structural shifts to an extent, has about 165,000 members today. So that has the kind of impact. So it isn't just a question of, of COSATU not wanting to do it, but also there was structural shifts as well. But also I think, post 94, not just here, but, across the world, you've seen the kind of the rise of outsourcing, of labor broking, of casualization, the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, AI, e-platform work, etc. So you might also find that that has an impact too. We have an economy with a 40% plus unemployment rate. When workers become desperate to secure a job, often workers become very scared, reluctant, not just to assert their labor rights, whether it's to overtime pay, etc., but even to join a union, because an employer will simply say, well, join a union and we'll dismiss you. But also you might find that, at a Pick and Pay or another retail supermarket, what might have previously been everybody working for that company, you might find that the cashiers from this labor broker, the shelf packer from this labor broker, the security guards is from another company, etc. And then we also had the opening of the border, so to speak, a flood of migration too. And that also has an impact because as much as we will complain correctly about our 40% unemployment rate and our poverty and inequality, etc., if you look at Zimbabwe, unemployment may be double that rate. So, migrant workers from a country with far more difficult socioeconomic, even political challenges will be willing here, even other countries too. We see the same issue in the US and with Mexican migrant workers. Will be willing to accept less favorable conditions. We're willing to sacrifice labor rights, right to minimum wage, will not even know or dare join a union because out of desperation for work. So you often find employers exploit that. So hence you've seen the rise of migrant workers, in agriculture and hospitality and, and fuel and construction, etc. And you can see the consequences. So, if you remember the construction accident in George, was it last year or thereabouts? Most of those workers, migrant workers, and you find that employer violated almost every single labor right under the sun. I think so. That's kind of some of your contextual issues, but I think also as a labor movement, I think we're all guilty as well. And it's natural. I think we're used to organizing in our comfort zone, so we know how to organize in the mining sector. So mining sector is heavily unionized, overwhelmingly. We're used to organizing in the clothing sector, largely organized. Often we struggle to organize in new sectors. So if you look at, the Uber Eats, the call centers, the 60/60s of Checkers, etc. Most are not unionized. Sometimes because they're from other countries. Sometimes because also the employer says, well, actually, you're not workers. You're self-employed. You're subcontractors or you're contractors, etc. And that creates a barrier. But I think also we're also guilty, and I don't know if comrades have read the Ray Alexander's memoirs, but if you haven't, I would really encourage comrades to do that, because she really, as much as we can complain in the 21st century in a constitutional democracy about how difficult it is to organize, and it is, but Ray Alexander, as a young teenager even, was organizing workers. And that time you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have emails, you didn't have WhatsApps. And she would go door to door along the West Coast, from Betty's Bay to Saldanha, etc. Just go to random clothing factories and sign up workers, and then bully the manager to go and give them transport afterwards. So I think the point is we need to also start kind of getting back to basics, and sometimes it is just about going door to door, doing the hard work. The benefits of democracy also does create a bit of a lull and a sense of activism as well. And I think we're all guilty of that. I don't think we've collectively, as a labor movement, not just COSATU, but the broader labor movement, I don't think we've done justice in terms of thinking out of the box, having proper strategies around recruitment, how to get new workers on board. At times also we are also guilty that the best way to recruit workers is to service existing members. And if existing members have a good news story to tell about how this union managed to improve their salaries or their benefits or defend the workers' jobs, that's the best brand ambassador you can have, etc., etc. So I think that's also an issue. The other difficulty is that you tend to find, and I think the report also indicates it, about unions fighting over the existing membership within the same sector. So these workers are already unionized, let's get them to join our union. So we focus on the 25%, which is organized, but we tend to forget about the 75%, which is unorganized. One of the interesting kind of parts, also scary or depressing, the report is about, so we have, 27 or so bargaining councils, but so many of them are dysfunctional, so many of them are weak. We saw that in COVID as well, when we wanted to enlist them to help roll out the UF COVID-19 tours. Many of them couldn't even do the most basics. So that's also a challenge. And, bargaining council will be as strong as the unions in it are strong. Other challenge also we've had is a fragmentation of the labor movement. So I think the study does speak to, the NUMSA, FAO, departure from COSATU, etc. But you find many unions in COSATU and other federations. There's a leadership tussle at a Congress, someone gets purged, somebody resigns, form a new union. So, COSATU, we've got about 16 unions, but we have about 200 in the country. Many of them are very small, as the study indicates, 500 members, which is not sustainable. And so that's always a particular curse of the left across the world, of kind of always fighting amongst ourselves instead of focusing on the broader picture, why are we here, etc. There's also a difficulty, I think the study does hint on it a bit, of mergers. So we merge, Union X and say organize sectors 1, 2, and 3. Often we neglect one of those sectors because it's a bit more complicated. And you might have found that previously there was a smaller union which organized there, but that sector just gets forgotten about because of focusing on the bigger, easier sectors. There's also was a challenge, a good challenge, but a brain drain of skilled, experienced leaders from COSATU, post-94 and each successive election, a difficulty, how do you attract the next generation, the millennials, etc. And I think we also tend to neglect that or underestimate that, people like Mario, etc., who grew up under apartheid, were socialized under apartheid, that a union movement is the key umbrella to defeating apartheid, etc. Now we must appeal to millennials who have no idea what apartheid was like and are focusing now on the challenges of youth unemployment, etc., etc. And so that means we also have to get back to basics, the bread and butter issues, to show members, like what COSATU, Clothing Workers, does. Investing in pension funds, bargaining council, health clinics, investing in bursaries for members' children, so you uplift the next generation, generational empowerment. And maybe if I get to the end here, COSATU Clothing is a good example of what to do. During COVID, they had almost a military-like operation to roll out UIF tours to each factory, make sure all workers are covered, to roll out the vaccination campaign to make sure all workers are safe, etc. Drive many benefits, and they would even link a minimum wage and law, how to improve upon that for factory workers. So that's a good example. If I can make an example of Sapao chemical workers, where fights amongst unions around investment funds, who's a leader, etc., led to almost a potential collapse of the union, which has now been under administration for the past 5 years. So there's good examples. There's also scary examples we need to learn from. So I think let me stop there, Chair, and I think to appreciate Ian and Shane and Mario's really excellent work and the very useful lessons and introspection that we need to take seriously as COSATU in the broader labor movement. But yeah, thanks, Chair. Hopefully I didn't talk too long. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much, Matthew, and thanks to all 4 speakers for both presenting this detailed research and starting the process of responding. I'm going to ask if there are any hands that want to be raised, and if not, I'll pose a few questions. Anybody from the floor raising their hands? I see the first is Merle. So let's see if I can, am I in a position to?
Merle should be able to unmute.
Okay, Merle, are you able to
I'm unmuted. Hello. Can I give it a go? Can you hear me?
Hello, Merle. Yes, yes, go ahead. Maybe
All
just
right.
introduce yourself and give your union background.
Well, Mario gave me the title of being a veteran. So I guess there's some truth in that. I come from the municipal sector from the early 80s. In fact, late 70s, mid 70s, yes. It's straight from 1976. So my background is mainly in the municipal sector, and at the time was familiar with local government. So it's very interesting from the inputs, and it sounds like a very comprehensive bit of research that was done. So thanks very much for that. It reminded me of the early debates and discussions when Shane spoke about a shift to perhaps shaping unions into sectors, not just industries. Now, at the time of mergers, when COSATU was formed, there was quite a debate as to which components fall within the public sector. And we were stuck in local government. And there was this thinking that we can all go together and be one big public sector union that includes local government. That never quite materialized, though there was an attempt of the public sector mergers and local government to merge. That wasn't carried through. And I think an important point that perhaps could be borne in mind when you consider sectors today is that government departments, government workers, the public sector, there's an established bargaining council system, which is quite elaborate. And public and government sector, they get their money from the tax base, a national tax base. So from SARS, they get their money. Local government's base of income comes from local rates and taxes. So to combine that in collective bargaining seems challenging. I think it's from an outsider, it seems that one needs to bear in mind the nature of the sectors being grouped more broadly. Then just a few points on local government, what was very, very challenging at the time, but made SAMWU, I think, the fastest growing union in the early 90s, because it was one of the most unorganized sectors. Most municipal workers did not belong to a trade union. And that fact became an important driving force, that organizing became the priority. So it didn't really get too lost in some of the other challenges, like registration, whether the union is registered or not. I think we started off, Mario can correct me if my memory fails me, but we were like between 6 and 8 different unions that merged to form SAMWU. And many of those unions were from, some of them were from COSATU, some of them were UDF unions, and then some were more established unions. In Cape Town, for example, was a more established union. So the political restructuring at the time was a big one to contend with, because you dealt directly with apartheid structures. Every local authority had a black local authority that was separate. So in George, you spoke about George earlier, there was the white municipality and you had the black local authority. In Cape Town, you had the Cape Town City Council and you had ICAPA. And in PE, you would have the Port Elizabeth Municipality and Ibai Town Council. So geographically, it was split in apartheid formations. And that is where most of the attention and challenges and energy was to drive and organize within that sector, bearing in mind that the right to strike did not exist. So organizing, recruiting, and the right to strike were very, very important elements in recruiting and becoming quite a fast-growing union. On the mergers, it wasn't. Look, I think we pulled off quite well. There were unions with distinct political stances. But because it was the most disorganized sector, the fact of the importance of recruiting drove across areas that would otherwise be pretty contentious and tend to stagnate. But yeah, recruiting was an important one. And linked to collective bargaining, the state of bargaining councils at the time, bearing in mind that there was resistance to registration of a union, therefore you couldn't get stop orders easily. And in any event, bargaining councils didn't exist throughout the country. In some cities it existed, but I think it was mostly because the union recruited at a hell of a pace that it organized the employers into bargaining councils, collective bargaining formations. But really, it was one by one with municipality after municipality, and each municipality was divided. So I just raise this as an interesting sharing. So metros didn't exist. It became what they called major cities, and major cities became metros, and it embraced all the black local authorities. So the union had to be directly involved in the political transformation of local government. So with all of that, I think it's those challenges and the fact that it wasn't an organized sector that it gave the union its national form. I'll take it all there. Just a little
Thanks very much, Mel. Do any of the speakers want to respond to those issues?
Paul, it's tempting, but I think we should perhaps take some more questions.
All right, I see the next hand up is Omar Parker. Omar, are you able to
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, comrades. So
Omar, you'll explain that you represent two sectors in your history.
Yeah, Paul. Yeah, no, very briefly, I will cut my teeth in the labor movement in the very early 80s from MAU, the Metal and Allied Workers Union, and later within NUMSA, of course, working for being a very long active shop steward in NUMSA, and later worked for public sector union NUPSO, SAFTU affiliate. When I left, I entered a new space, which is, to organize amongst the platform workers, particularly the ride sharing, Uber, and so on. So now I'm actually serving as the General Secretary of the National E-Hailing Federation of South Africa. But very quickly, I just want to perhaps just highlight one thing. I think the study, or so far, it's been very, very interesting to listen to the work done by the colleagues. But I wanted just to zoom into something, but I don't also want to romanticize the point I want to make or elevate it to a point where it has become or where it's seen to be an irreconcilable contradiction. But what for me stood out when I was a young shop steward in the early days, when when the political shifts took place after the adoption of the Harare Declaration, COSATU was confronted with, the unions were confronted with the internal debates of, also a realignment of forces within the country. And the question of the adoption of the Freedom Charter became a very, thorny discourse in that particular period. And I remember, the commercial allied workers, Sakao, Kahusa at the time, there was, intense debate, and that also contributed to a split. But equally so, even within NUMSA, later MAU, with other unions, that also surfaced as a very serious and contentious debate as to, the adoption of the Freedom Charter. Some were, labeled as workerists, others were, it became very intense. And I'm just trying to perhaps understand to what extent that also got carried over, over the next periods following that, and to what extent that also has impacted, on the ability to carry through that noble vision of COSATU of building one, union, one industry. Of course, I think there were a lot of complexities also attached to that, and I think those things have been highlighted also of recently, the restructuring internationally, and also, disruption of technology in the labor market. We see now a key focus on, internationally on the rights, on platform workers, developing standard setting for, international stable standards for labor standards for platform workers, which will be dealt with now, in June at Geneva. But I'm just saying that particular element for me also, I think, was quite significant. It also, to an extent, impacted, but I just wanted to perhaps also get a feel from the colleagues, maybe in terms of a response, as to whether that indeed had a significant impact in how it actually played itself out later. Of course, if one look at it in retrospect now, even the Freedom Charter is quite a progressive political, program and position to advance, because quite frankly, there's been a serious undermining and departure from the Freedom Charter as, the way we got to understand it and the way we got to advance it. So let me just stop there with those few points. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Omar. Any further hands up? Right. I had one. Is that a Mabuti? Would you like to? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Thanks, Paul, and other speakers who came before. Me as a young student, in terms of COSATU, I think the speakers, they are right in what they have seen it, especially in the decline of membership and etc. But I think one of the key factor here that we should also consider is the issue of the tripartite alliance. To say, is the tripartite alliance still relevant in this era? And I'll give an example to say what is happening currently, especially in terms of the decision that was taken recently by the Communist Party, SACP, when they decided in their National Congress to say they are going to contest the local government elections. And when you look into the decision of the NEC of the African National Congress, where they said they are giving members of SACP, those who are in critical positions within governance, to choose between the two. So this really caused a tension on leadership, and it also affects the inconsistent of service delivered on the ground. So my point exactly is the question that I want to put before is this alliance still relevant in this era that we are in terms of COSATU, particularly as a federation? I'll pause here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any other hands? There does seem to be a linked issue, and that is to what extent the increasing public sector dominance of the unions has an impact on those type of political issues within union federations. But we leave that to the panel. Chumani, would you like to speak now?
Yes, please.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, you.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the presentation. I just want to find out from the colleagues about the broad history of the labor movement, whether or not what we see now as a result of the decline of the unionization of the workspace, whether it's because of the type of leaders we had in the unions. For example, now we've got a state president who was a former union member or a leader. It seems to me that those who were leaders of unions, including, for example, the Minister of Minerals, Gwedemantashe, they never implemented that which they were fighting for, particularly for unions, let alone the political spectrum. But if today you've got a minister who was a former leader of a union, a president who was a former leader of a union, one way or another, the president is a billionaire, the minister forces the communities to be overtaken by multinational companies such as Shell, and he feels no shame about promoting such programs. Whether can we then be able to apportion a blame in the decline of union and the unionization in the workplace to these type of leaders that we have today? Is that a fair assessment? And of course, it's not just the two, but across the board. At some point, I read about someone who owns ENCA, who's a multi-billion-dollar person, and then he was a former member of the union or secretary or something, but today he's a multi-billion-dollar person. Now, there are many cases or references that one can make to these individuals whom today seemingly they've joined the capitalist class to rule South Africa. I'm just really merely interested whether can we blame the leaders in the decline of unionization in South Africa. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for that question, which may go beyond the paper, but the speakers may feel free to respond to it. Tumeleng, would you like to ask your question?
Mine is not really a question. I would just like to reiterate something, especially on the tripartite alliance. Because today you find out there's something that you said. I'm sorry, I'm driving. Something that you said about the union in the public sector. Because you may find out that the union in the public sector are part of the municipalities. And in terms of service delivery, they are not doing, the workers in the public sector are not doing what they are supposed to be doing. And now we are affiliating to the same union, and we cannot publicly condemn what is happening because now we're falling under the same umbrella, which is COSATU. And that in itself, when you reference that with this era that we're in, the working class has changed, has transformed in some way. It has transformed in a way that the working class is no longer your assistants or your K3 to 8. I don't know. I'm speaking a main language. Your K3 to 8, but it's now your officials. And those people, the working class of today, in comparison to the working class of when COSATU was formed, including the unions, has somehow evolved. And today, the working class don't see the need then to be unionized because there's a contradiction in this broad church of COSATU. So then there needs to be a serious introspection in this tripartite alliance. Is it still serving the same purpose? because there's a speaker that spoke about SACP interest in the local elections to partake in that. Now, if we are having a vanguard, which is the SACP, because SACP is supposed to be the vanguard to give direction and order. So if now they are participating and they are going to be active in the economy directly, so especially in the local government, what does where does it put us as a working class and the relevance of the tripartite alliance? That is why maybe most of the working class that we're having today don't see the need to be actively involved in unions. That's my observations.
All right, thanks. So that would affect representativity. The last question I'm going to take now is from someone known as Project Manager 1, and then we'll allow the panel to respond.
Yes, good day, Comrade Paul. I couldn't.
Won't you just introduce yourself?
Yes, I couldn't rename myself. I'm Bethwell Masirumule.
Oh, Bethel, hello, how are you?
Hi, Comrade, I'm well, yeah. Yes, I am formerly with MAU back then and then moved into NUMSA. And recently I've just retired from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, where I was still doing some support work for labor, but mostly at Africa regional level. And I also need to appreciate the work of the comrades. I think these are fundamental questions about the character of the unions and how to rebuild the unions and to rebuild our power in the labor movement for change. But I have just a very short question. Since the articles and the inputs recognize that changes in the world economy, in other words, the changes in the South African economy that have affected unions are also sort of worldwide changes. I was just curious as to whether you looked at any examples in other countries of how they were responding to these changes through the kind of restructuring measures that Comrade Shane was referring to. Because I think in countries like Germany, I think they noticed the same trend about the changes and how they are affecting the labor markets and decided to reorganize their affiliates, such that I think they're down to about 7 or 8 affiliates now in the National Center. I think at the global union federation level, I think they've been consolidating themselves as well. So you have got also just there around seven or six global union federations. So I was curious as to whether there has been any attempt to look at international experiences around this very topic. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Beth. Well, that's a wide range of questions. If I could just pose one question, and that is, how you focused largely on unions, sectors with formal bargaining councils, but in those sectors or industries with sectoral bargaining that isn't necessarily statutory, how do these patterns play out in a similar way or a different way? That was the one issue that I thought might be useful, but I'll allow, I think, each of the panelists a few minutes to respond to any of those questions. So shall we start with you, Ian?
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. And thanks to the colleagues for the comments, inputs, and questions. I'm just going to pick up on one or two. I mean, firstly, just to acknowledge Merle Brown's input, and I think it was a good illustration of some of the complexities involved in a restructuring or revitalization project within the union movement, looking back to what was happening at the merger process in local government at the time. And I think Shane touched on this. Many of those complexities, even though they might take a slightly different form today, but they certainly still exist. But just as, I would just like to say, just as at the time there was a strategic sense to the merger process that started under COSATU. I mean, I think our argument is that given the changes that many colleagues have illustrated and touched on, today there's an equal need to really prioritize a restructuring or revitalization process within the trade union movement. And we were making the point to COSATU, but I think it might well apply to others as well, or other federations in particular. A second point from Omar's comment, and Paul, you touched on this as well. Well, let me start with Omar's point about the carryover of some of the political ideas and alignments within these talks about change in the trade unions and mergers. We didn't really focus on that. Our focus was on COSATU, which, despite its own political internal complexities, and Matthew is much more qualified to speak about that, but that wasn't really what we were looking at. So it's difficult to comment on. But I think the issue that Omar and Paul, that you touched on, is how the politics in the public sector are now playing out. And that also possibly relates to the issue that Chumani and Itumeleng have raised about the tripartite alliance. And I think it's a critical issue, which would require a study on its own, because I think it does shape the interactions between unions and employers in particular ways. But just the thought that comes to my mind as you were making these comments and posing the questions is that I think it's maybe we need to be thinking and taking more seriously the political phase we're in, which is one of a government of national unity as the dominant political form. And there may be a separate debate to be had about what one might learn from the politics of unity within government for that sort of exercise within the trade union movement. And that leads to my last point before I hand over to my colleagues, and that is to pick up on what Chumani, Itumeleng have raised. And I think Bethwell's comment, I hope Shane will deal with on the international restructuring, because that was an important part of what we looked at. But Chumani and Itumeleng, I must disagree that I think there's an assumption in your inputs about the propensity for workers to join trade unions today, and implying that they're less interested, either because for political reasons, for the leadership who might have sold out the working class, or for other reasons. But I think that's quite wrong, actually. I mean, one of the standout features of the South African trade union movement, and if you look at the figures, is that unlike many other countries internationally, the membership overall within the South African labor market of trade unionism has remained pretty constant at around 29 to 30%. In other words, there's not been a collapse of trade unionism in South Africa. And if anything, and this goes back to the point Merle made about recruiting that was important back in the 80s, if anything, there are indications that workers, whether they're platform workers whether they short-term contract workers in pick and pay, shelf packers or whatever, but they're not uninterested in joining trade unions. They are interested in joining organizations that can assist them, that can protect them, etc. And the steady presence and not enough growth perhaps, but the steady state of the trade union movement in South Africa, I think, says a lot about the interest of workers in remaining in the trade union movement. But with that, let me hand over to Mario and Shane.
Thanks. Jan, Mario, you want to come in?
Yes, I'll be very quick. I align myself with what Ian is saying. There's not been a decrease. In fact, over the last 20-odd years, you see trade union membership has been steady between 29 to 30%. So the political environment certainly has not impacted on trade union fluctuation in any great detail. For if people were dissatisfied with whichever government is running in the present period, the line of argument as presented would be that there would be a decline or significant decline in trade union membership. There's been no such decline. It's been stable over the last 20-odd years at the level of 29 or between 28 and 30%. What has not been the case is an intake of workers engaged in what we would call externalized work practices like platform work, etc. So I think that is recognized also by trade union leaders, what they refer to as the 30-70%. So the 70% has not been penetrated in terms of organizing. I agree with Ian too that, and hopefully Shane will speak to the international experiences or examples, because the COSATU report covers that in great detail with a number of countries and national centers we looked at for the purposes of mergers. Paul, I want to, just before I answer more, I need to just quickly deal with non-bargaining council sectors. So retail, for example, it doesn't have a bargaining council. Yes, it does have a sectoral determination, but within the retail sector, you're more likely to find collective bargaining taking place at plant level being at company level. So whether it be at ShopRite, Pick and Pay, Massmart, etc. So that is where SACAWU would have its concentration for the purpose of collective bargaining. And in many ways, it is a structured form of collective bargaining. In the absence of a bargaining council arrangement, you will find something similar in the mining sector, what used to be done under the Chamber of Mines, which is now done under the Minerals Council of South Africa. Again, structured form of collective bargaining within that particular sector and key industries within mining. And the same you will find also in auto manufacturing, where NUMSA organizes well over 80% of auto manufacturers, yet AMIO representing auto manufacturers and NUMSA, even though in principle they've long ago agreed for the establishment of a bargaining council, it has never sort of moved towards the actual establishment of a bargaining council within the auto industry. And in many ways, some of those examples I've made, particularly in the case of auto, you have a high concentration of union membership within that particular industry. Just a quick point to Mo, and hopefully I can reflect on some of my local government experience. There's when COSATU was formed, initially there was meant to be one public service union. So there was not meant to be a SAMU and an AHAWU existing at the same time. But and this is part of the problems we point to in the demarcation report, that in as much as there was broad resolution for the establishment of a single public sector union, there was a recognition that given the fact that local government is distinct from provincial and national government, also in terms of the legislative framework, that maybe it would be better for local government to be a separate trade union than the general public administration. Bearing also in mind that at the time, which was 1987, the strategic decision was that Nahawu would primarily, or certainly in the first phase, only focus on education and health workers, and later it would begin to emerge as the general public service unit, even though I think, as we point out in the report and in the article, if Nahawu were to have progressed to be the public service union, then you never should have, or COSATU never should have allowed for the establishment and affiliation of public service unions under the fold of COSATU. And then lastly, Mo, just the one point is that you may recall that SAMU and Nahawu at some states engaged in serious merger discussions. In fact, at one COSATU Congress, they went under the umbrella of a single public service union. Mergers are complex. A number of issues came to the fore: the financial standing of the unions, the membership that the unions declared, the political resolutions that the unions wanted to incorporate it as non-negotiable policies. So given the context of those complexities, that merger never fully materialized. And that again points to the complexities of merger processes, not just then, but also now. So what some people refer to, and in fact, I mean, as I pointed out, we make a number of recommendations in the actual report, and we do, for the purpose of mergers, we identify 9 points that we think unions should consider for the purpose of merger engagements, starting off with low-hanging fruits, as people call them, etc. But let me stop there and hand over to Shane.
All right, Shane, thanks.
Hi, thanks, Paul. Just on the, I'm not quite so optimistic as Ian and Mario on the issue of unions not losing members, and there's still an appetite for unionism amongst workers, and I don't say that there isn't, but I just want to emphasize, Mario spoke about this notion of 30-70, which came up repeatedly in the interviews we did. And a unionist said, why are we fighting about the 30% that are already organized and trying to win them to our union from other unions when there's 70% of the labor market is unorganized? Why aren't we organizing them? And Matthew referred to it as the 25-75% split. And I'm sorry to hear it's gone up to 75 now. But the problem is, I mean, unions are still, the total unionization is still actually growing, although at the same time that the labor market's growing. So we're sticking at about 30%, but we haven't made inroads into that 30%. And that seems to me a major problem that we should be thinking about, and why aren't we making inroads into that 30%, and what do those workers need? And if it isn't the existing unions, then what shape should unions take to address the sorts of needs that those workers have? Because I'm sure those workers need support and would want to be involved in some sort of union that gives them protection. The other point, just Merle in the public sector, I just think in a sense, we realized doing the research just how complicated the public sector is. And it raises a whole lot of sort of unique problems that come up in the public sector. So to us, it almost became something that was going to be, that needed to be a project on its own as to how to tackle the public sector. And I don't think we got beyond a fairly sort of superficial understanding of that sector and what needs to be done in that sector. But I think our conclusion is that the private sector is the priority and should be the priority within COSATU. My concern is, in a federation that's increasingly dominated by public sector unions, is the private sector going to become the priority when those public sector unions don't see any real interest or benefit from assisting those private sector unions, or subsidizing in some way the turnaround of those private sector unions. Lastly, Bethel, your question is an important one, and we, in the reports we did actually have quite a long section looking at international examples. And I mean, there's a lot of literature now, mainly on developed countries in Europe, Australia, and the USA, looking at this thing they're calling trade union revitalization. We also looked at quite a few examples in Africa of trade union revitalization. Most of those looking at how unions are organizing. There's a famous example in Uganda of this transport union that started organizing these little motorbike taxi people and so on, and boosted its membership enormously, and completely turned around the fortunes of that union. So there are these many interesting examples going on. What comes across is, certainly in the developed countries, is a more of a propensity to engage with the issue and prepare to be innovative, because one can get bogged down in all the reasons why we can't do this. And there seemed to be more a sense of, we can't carry on, it can't be business as usual anymore, and we need to restructure in some way. And a lot of that is about getting to the youth and getting to women, getting to immigrant workers as potential members, and how do we offer them a better sort of deal, if you want, as unions, to organize those people and better understand what they needed. And I mean, an example of that is the FNV, which Bethel, I'm sure you know, the Dutch trade sort of social democratic trade union federation that was involved a long time in South Africa as well. And that came to a crisis that sort of deadlocked that union federation for about a year and almost collapsed it. And they just carried on debating and fighting and thinking about it, and then came out with this sort of innovative hybrid form of organization where they now half the union is a federation, and the other half is a big multi-sector union where you had about 16 sectors have become departments within that union. And at the same time, there are about 14 affiliates that are either small federations or affiliates that have joined FNV on the basis that it's a federation. And it seems a bit unwieldy to look at, but it's working, and they're making it work. And that's the sort of thinking I think that we need to apply here. And it comes across in the literature so much that this is it's not an easy issue, and you're going to make mistakes, and you need to experiment and fail and learn and then move forward on this. The thing is, no one has come up in this whole trade union revitalization process. No one has come up, and a lot of that is about really recognition that the industrial union model has it's past its sell-by date, and some new sort of model needs to be found. None of them have found that model, and in many cases they've gone through big merger processes that they hoped would completely reposition unions and grow those unions, and in a lot of instances they haven't actually grown. What they have done is sort of shored up that union and stopped its continued decline and stopped losing membership, but they haven't really grown. So it's a journey that unions are. I mean, the economy and technology is changing so rapidly. It's going to be a while, I think, before unions really find a new way of working with members and working with employers, and new forms of collective bargaining, for informally employed workers. It's going to need a lot of innovation. So that literature is very interesting to look at. I think let me leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Shane. Normally, as you know, we run these seminars till about 5:15. Anyway, at 6 o'clock, we still have 66 participants, which is excellent. So just to thank you all for attending. Thank you for a range of contributions coming from across the generations. And I'm just going to then hand over to allow Matthew Parks, as he often does, have the last word, and then we can all log off. Thanks. Over to you, Matthew.
Okay, no, thanks. So maybe just a few questions, or maybe two responses quickly. The relevance of the alliance, I think we would still say is relevant, given a 41% unemployment rate, high levels of inequality, of poverty, etc. And I think we're still very far down the road in terms of our transformation agenda. So I think for us it's still relevant. And of course, yes, there's challenges. One doesn't dispute that. But I think there's also major successes too. And we've always felt it's useful, with all of the limitations, to have access to a minister, like comrades were saying, who comes from the union movement. Yes, you'll still have to fight, but it helps that. If we look at other federations who don't have that access, they struggle to get those things through. Not saying it's perfect, but it helps. Look, I think in our experience, really, most workers join unions not because we're in alliance with the ANC or because we're not in alliance with the ANC or the party, but because they want to see better wages, better working conditions. And the most effective way, if we're going to recruit workers, get out of the 25% cul-de-sac, is to service our members better, to be responsive to members. We've always found the biggest gripe with all of our members across unions has been that the shop steward, the organizer, the union, or even COSATU doesn't respond to the issues on a bread and butter basis. We have to do the fragmentation of the labor movement, because our experience that no union with 500 members can be effective. So how to unite them? But I think colleagues are also right to say that we shouldn't just rely upon the successes of 1994 or the Labour Relations Act or the Minimum Wage Act, even more recently. But we have to, if we want to attract young people, to focus on today's challenges and focus on the challenge of tomorrow's, the e-platform workers as an example. And I think lastly, Chair, is that to look at international examples. So in the US, you've seen the labor movement shrink from about 30% to about 10% of workers. So often similar challenges to us. But also the successes too. We can look at Scandinavia, where they have a 70, 80% unionization rate. And it's because, again, they focus on bread and butter issues. They have the challenges, yes, no doubt, but there's also useful examples to learn from there as well. And I think also lastly, Chair, is that we shouldn't just beat ourselves up. There are major successes the union movement has achieved. Minimum wage. Paul would know some of the issues we managed to secure in the labor law discussion on pension fund compliance, even around how to adapt the labor laws to atypical workers, to on-call workers, etc. So there is successes too, and we must also kind of, build upon those as well. But yeah, let me stop there, Chair, before I go on, and just to thank yourself and Shane and Mario and Ian for the excellent work as always. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks, Matthew. Thanks to our three panelists, and a good evening to everybody. Thanks. A transcription will be available at some point. Thanks.
Thanks for
Thanks
hosting
all.
us.
All right. Bye-bye.